which is why I put it together the way it is. I'm going to summarize something about tank cars in general. I'm going to talk about a lot of SP tank car classes, not all of them, and then I'm going to, at Harry's request, cover all the 60s tank cars as well, and I'll talk about modeling as I go along. So here's the outline. I'm going to say some background about SP and SP's car fleet. And then in tank cars, I'm going to talk about tank car construction, and then SP cars by era, a little bit about modeling, and a few operations photos just to remind you of a few things. It's a great photo taken up at Sims. You can see Mount Shasta in the distance. I was just up there the last couple days, and it's not nearly that white right now. This is during World War II, one of these trains of tank cars, which even in the West Coast were a big part of the transportation. And of course, most pictures of SP freight cars, freight car trains will show you tank cars, and so that's what we're talking about. Most of the photos here are SP ones. They're all individually credited on the slides. I got some through SP sources. Steve Perry, John Signor had those. CSRM now has a lot of them. Today, all the SP mechanical department photos are at Stanford, and they're making them available, so that's really helpful. They're all in digital form. And of course, we owe a real vote of thanks to all the amateurs, Paul Dunn, Will Whitaker, and lots of others who were taking pictures of freight cars when their friends were taking pictures of locomotives. So a lot of the stuff that we have, very important stuff that you'll see from amateurs, are people we owe a debt of thanks to, and to remind you, go out and photograph them today, because someday photos you take now will be real interesting historical photos. I'd like to say a little bit about traffic. SP annual reports in 52 and 53 were about that. This is the 52 annual report. Notice right here in the middle is by far the most profitable category, which was perishables. Right next to it is lumber, which was number 2 at the time. They've got mine products, auto assembly plants on the West Coast, ports of coast on the Pacific Coast and the Gulf Coast, other agricultural things like cotton. And then the next year they went to this Golden Empire graphic, which has little, what we might call icons all over the system showing traffic from those areas. And the one thing this reminds you is that if you model Oregon, you're going to have a different mix of SP freight cars than if you model Louisiana or anywhere in between. So when we talk about SP freight cars, we inevitably are generalizing over very different regions of the country. I'll talk a little bit about the car fleet here. And here I put the national car fleet in 1950 in the same order of cars. That's why they're in the order that they are. And the percentages are shown above the bars. And you can see SP's is very different. Every railroad is pretty different than the national average. One of the reasons, of course, is that no railroad had exactly the traffic mix that averages over the whole country. But the other part is freight cars, because most railroads didn't own very many tank cars. Actually, SP did, but most railroads didn't because they were mostly in private ownership. A lot of refrigerator cars were in private ownership, and I've shown 0 here because, of course, SP's cars were owned by Pacific Fruit Express. So this gives you a feeling for how different SP's traffic, we can recognize things like the lumber on the flat cars. And I know bar graphs are a little boring, so I made a pie chart to. these are the same data. So what's distinctive about SP tank cars? Well, in the transition era and up into the 60s, a huge number of them were 12,500 gallons, which in that era was a pretty darn big freight car. So these are bigger than most other kinds of tank cars. We're all familiar with what they looked like because the Athearn single dome tank car is definitely based on, though not the same as, the SP cars, and it is big. So a lot of modelers have gotten the idea that tank cars should be that big. Actually, it's much bigger than normal in a sense. And I'll just mention common standard car classification. There's a letter for the car type, a number with a nominal capacity in tons, and then a chronological design number. Not all designs got built. Sometimes there are numbers which represent things not built. Tank cars are interesting because the O for oil cars is the signal for that. So you might not think at first of a tank car as an O, but there'll be numbers like O50 for tank cars. Paint schemes, I'll talk about exceptions in a minute. but they were black, with the exceptions. Here's the lettering, the exceptions here, Colonial Yellow, which is exactly the same color as Depot's. That was the gasoline service color. Originally, the diesel fuel service cars were all silver. In the 50s, they introduced the car with just a silver instripe, and I'll show pictures of those later. And then there's that white diamond on the dome with the large letter S. That means a car that had bottom outlet equipped for sugar service. Didn't mean the car was in sugar service, it just meant it could be if it was appropriately cleaned. And in later years, these were very familiar in company fuel service, still with the S on the dome. So that only referred to the equipment. Now let me go back to the lettering here and mention that until 1917, people didn't use stripes around reporting marks and numbers. That's around the time that the ARA recommended it, and the SP adopted it in 1917. And from then until actually 31, they kept periods in the initials. I said 36 though because there were no new cars built between 31 and 36. So this didn't really take effect until 36. And then from 36 to 46, there were no periods, followed by the famous change in 1946. A great deal of SP lettering changed, and they began to spell out the name Southern Pacific. And you see that also on tank cars, and we'll see that in the photos. In 1952, they began to omit those 1-inch stripes, and gradually, as cars got repainted, that went away. The initials SP reappeared in place of the spelled out road name, and then in July 1955 is when the block or Gothic lettering showed up to replace eventually the circle and bar emblem. So we've sort of said enough about this, and I'll go on to tank cars, and I'll start with some language about tank car construction so that you know what I'm talking about. One way that early tank cars were built, and I'll show you a picture of one, were simply radial section tanks like this, or with circumferential joints. This is the same as a steam locomotive boiler. So there was no trick in making them. Some people seem to think that early iron tank cars were a big thing, but they're the same as boilers, so this is really not hard to build. Part of the problem, though, is that down here at the bottom is the place where the highest pressure is and the most tendency to leak. So they began to make 4-course tanks with longitudinal joints, and now you've got a bottom sheet, so there's not a seam running under the bottom. And eventually, with bigger rolling equipment, they could go to 3-course tanks, and we'll see pictures of those. SP had all these different kinds of tanks at different times. The other thing is you can add the bottom sheet to those circumferential sections. This is a sketch of one that's riveted along the bottom, of course, and then there's rivet seams along these things. And SP had a lot of those, and I'll show how I modeled one. After 1910, nearly all tank cars, not just SP, but everybody, was built with bottom sheets because they didn't leak. So let's start with a picture of an early tank car. This one's got the circumferential sections that go all the way around the bottom. There was a problem in those days with keeping the tank in place on this frame. It may look kind of like a flat car, but it isn't. It's an open frame, although it's planked over the ends for the convenience of trainmen. Notice there's these hold downs that hold the tank down. There's blocks at the end to keep the tank from moving longitudinally. This particular car also has a little yoke around the dome. And you might think, what the heck is that for? That's so the tank can't rotate around its long axis. You don't care about the top so much, but there's an outlet valve at the bottom. You don't want that moving around and getting broken. So all these restraint things are something that you see in early cars. A guy named John Van Dyke, the same guy that invented the Van Dyke tank car, also invented a centering where you rivet the tank itself to the frame just in the center. You leave the whole rest of it unrestrained. Now it can't rotate, it can't move longitudinally, and it's completely tied down to the tank car. And within a few years, all tank cars were being built that way. So in later cars, we'll see that these construction details go away. The other thing that's important to remember is that in that day, the way you operated the valve at the bottom was a hand wheel at the top. So you opened the manway, and the workman would rotate the hand wheel. There's a valve, and the valve is inside the tank. It's not outside. This part that sticks outside is just an outlet pipe. The idea was if you break this off, and in fact they were scored so they would break off cleanly, the valve is still safe inside the tank and the contents hopefully don't come out. So these outlets with a little cap on the chain, and there are pictures, I'll show some later, where people left the cap hanging down on the chain when the car was empty. You weren't supposed to do that because dirt could get in, but workmen weren't always very careful. So this is what the internal construction is going on inside the car. Tank cars, of course, were unloaded from the bottom if it was a suitable cargo. These are unloading hoses. This is a rack that can also be used to load, so both loading and unloading could be done here. This is a Standard Oil refinery at Baytown, New Jersey. And of course, you loaded cars through the manway. This is waste lube oil being loaded at Bayshore, picture from 1981. And there you see the manway cover standing open. Originally, these closures of the manway were just a screw-in thing. You can see it's attached by a chain, and you just screwed it in. And the workman just would unscrew it. The problem is if there's pressure inside, when you come to the end of the thread, it comes right up in your face, which is really not so nice. So a different kind of manway was eventually adopted. Notice here there's no walkway on either side of this car. That's a buyer of the cars saving money by not putting those on. Workmen could figure out for themselves how to get on top of the car. What was replaced was the so-called improved manway. It had these bolt things around the circumference. You can see they're on little pivots, so you could loosen the bolts. The lid could come up but still be restrained by the nuts. As you loosened them, pressure could be released, and then when you opened it, the slots for the bolts are what are evident around the sides. The signal of that was the small diamond on the side of the dome. So when you see a picture of a tanker with that little diamond, it means there's an approved manway. But that wasn't required. That was at the option of the buyer or owner of the car. And many times if they were delivered new with those diamonds, when the cars were repainted, they didn't put the diamonds back on. So they're pretty variable. If you're modeling a particular car, you need to have a photo from the right era to tell if you should have a diamond on the dome. But most tank car decal sets do have the diamonds so that you can put them on. I had these two drawings made to the same scale so that you can see there's a 5-inch diameter and an exact identical internal construction of the safety valves. The ones on the elbow are just attached on the side, and this is just set into the top of the dome. So there's no operational difference at all between elbow safety valves and tank top safety valves. These are not only simpler, but because they're as high as they can be, you don't have the danger of sloshing or expanding liquid getting up into that elbow. So these eventually replaced those, but the elbow safety valves were never disallowed. So some people think eventually they were prohibited. That's not true. There's nothing wrong with an elbow safety valve in terms of performance. And we'll see SP tank cars built fairly late with those. But by about the end of the 20s, all tank cars were built with the dome top kind of safety valves. Okay, let's turn to SP cars. This picture I've always liked of the mountain local descending from the Hatchapee. And this picture at Beaumont when tank cars were very important as the coastwise tank traffic was being successfully attacked by German submarines, and more petroleum products had to be moved by rail. This is at Beaumont. Early tank cars, I'll just talk about three of them: CS-12s and 13, the Pease cars, and the CS-25As. CS, of course, means common standard. These were among the early 1890s Huntington-era car designs. Before that, SP did build rectangular boxes on tanks, and they were used in work service for years. This is a picture of the 20s of one in service. They're just a rectangular box on a frame. They're not on a flat car. It's a separate frame that doesn't have any flooring in it. And people have scratch built these. They're kind of neat. And there's pictures of them at least as late as the 30s in work service. The first real tank car was the CS-12. You can notice this doesn't have a bottom sheet, but notice that the joints are alternating in the different segments. Here the way the tank is restrained longitudinally is with these diagonal bands. There's no head block here that restrains it there. There's a whole bunch of hold downs. This has a very heavy construction under here, so it's a heavy looking tank car. SP also bought some from a company called Keys Construction Company. They had a very tall skinny dome. This is a little bit later picture. Notice it's got the yoke around the dome. The head block is down here in the frame. The defect in this car and a lot of early tank cars, to get the lower center of gravity and to set the tank down into the frame, they had to widen the pair of center sills. That meant that the draft gear was attached with a crosswise piece, which led to all kinds of trouble, even in normal service, let alone in wrecks. And eventually there was a maximum spacing of center sills of 18 inches that was adopted. So cars like this would not have been built in later years. The LaBelle kit for the tank cars can be made into one of these. This is one that I photographed of a friend of mine. He hadn't finished it yet, but it's got that tall skinny dome, and if you can find a LaBelle kit for these tank cars, they can be built into one of these, which did run in work train service up into the 50s. Then came the CS25As, the first all-steel car. Notice once again we've got this longitudinal restraint with the strap around the end. We've got the yoke around the dome. We've got a massive head block which is joined end to end with this rod the whole length of the car. It looks like they were really afraid of these tanks getting away from them. And all these separate turnbuckles down to the supports under the underframe. Now this looks like a fish belly car, but really it's not. This is a piece of channel, and this is riveted on. This is a pressed metal piece that's riveted on to make the fish belly stiffening. And here's another photo of one, a Stan Kistler photo, where you can really clearly see how that's a separate piece of the car. This is being used as an auxiliary water car. They were also in work train service into the 60s. They were obviously very well-built cars. And many of you will recognize what they look like. This, of course, is the old West Side tank car. Here's a picture of one. Steve Perry thought the picture was from about 54. And you can see all the original features are there, except that diagonal support has been taken off, and there's a center anchor in the car. Here's that West Side car. They call it a 1905 crude oil tank car, which is silly. They weren't built in 1905 and they weren't for crude oil, but it accurately reproduces all these different features, including the diagonals, which did remain on a few cars. So that's one on mine. In the Harriman era then, tank cars changed quite a bit. This was a time tank cars everywhere were changing. The 050-1 class probably was an experiment. They built 250. They then built more than 1,000 of the 050-2s. And more than that were ordered and not built at the last moment. They got some cars from Associated Oil. They traded some of their cars back and forth because Associated had gotten some of the 050-2s and they traded them with SP about 1960. Here's one of these cars, and this is in later years after it's been modified. These guys are making modifications. They've just torched off the attachment of that diagonal strap. You see these rivets here? That's where the strap was attached to that diagonal hold down. The reason it's been changed is there's now a center anchor, which you can't see. Notice there's no head block because that longitudinal restraint came from that diagonal rod. Here's a picture of the original arrangement. You can see the strap and the hold down coming down onto the side sill here. It's got the yoke around the dome. Safety valves are on either side of the top. It does have a bottom sheet, as you can see. This is San Diego and Arizona Eastern maintenance car. Here's what they did when they put the center anchors in. They riveted the center anchor onto the frame. They cut out a piece of the bottom here and added a new piece of sheet with all the rivet holes to rivet it onto there. And when you're all done, the center anchor then is the riveted attachment, and you don't need head blocks, you don't need the diagonal hold downs, you don't need the yoke around the dome. So this really was a tremendously more effective way of building tank. Some of the cars that got center anchors, SP also put a big plate on the end to help restrain it. Again, you can see the rivets where the diagonal hold downs were taken off, but There's a variety of different versions of these in later years. We don't have a good source of models for these. It'd be nice if somebody would do them in brass or styrene or in resin. After the Harriman era, tank car continued to grow because California oil fields were continuing to grow, as well as in Texas. These are among the first offshore fields in the world down there near Ventura. And I'll just talk about these three groups, and I'll just talk about these together: 050s, 5s, 6s, and 7s, and 8s. The 050-5s are a distinctive car, unique. SP didn't have anything else like this. The walkway is up a ways along the side of the tank, requiring a big sort of step ladder at the ends. The retainer valve is up here, riveted onto the end of the tank. It's got double safety valves on either side, which did not happen in later years. Here the lettering is still over on the right-hand half of the car, which was about to be disapproved by the ARA, not prohibited, but disapproved. Again, a very distinctive car. It was followed by the 050-6s, mostly for Pacific lines. These are what I call short, fat tanks. You'll see later what I mean when I talk about the more slender tanks. The master car builders had introduced a whole bunch of new standards, and you had to put a stripe on the end of the car that said MCB construction. That was required for a few years to signal that it was a new car. In those days, SP lettered the words oil car on the end, so we know very well where that O in the 050 classification came from. And arch bar trucks were obsolete at this time, but it was all that were available in this period. Then the 050-8s, which followed the 7s, are really different because now it's a long skinny tank. This is an SP design. It's got circumferential rows and a bottom sheet. Interestingly, it was built at Ralston, which is really not a tank car company. The odds are good that Ralston had a boiler and tank company build the tanks, and they just built the underframes. But this is the transition toward SP's standard tank car, which I'll talk about next. The standard tank car was built for years and in very substantial numbers. From the 9s through the 13s, 200 cars of each class, 200 and 175 of these, so really adding a lot of cars as tank cars go. And then finally the 050-14 is only 50 cars. That's a little 8,000 gallon car, an unusual part of the SP fleet. Here's an 050-9. This is the beginning of the standard tank cars. Everything about the proportions of the tank is on the SP drawings. So they would send these drawings. Instead of buying what the tank car company offered, they said build it this way. It's still got elbow safety valves, still got circumferential sheets, but there's a bottom sheet in the car. And I should make the point that all through SP's tank car history, they tended to put these walkways only on one side, and it's on the left side. The convention in tank cars, you stand at the B end where the brake wheel is, and what's on your left is the left side of the car. So the left side of the car normally had the platform. And here's the demonstration, both sides of the same car, platform on one side and not on the other. Notice also here the B end is the end toward which the safety valves are. And that was normal in SP practice and in most other tank car companies. When you look where the safety valves are on the top of the dome, it's normally toward the B end. And then the hand wheel is toward the A end. And so the opening of that manway is also toward the A end in most cars. Here's the 050-11s, the very last class to have these circumferential joints, but now it's got dome top safety valves. And then the 050-12s, the entire class, 175 cars, were all delivered in colonial yellow for gasoline service. There obviously was a need for a lot of gasoline cars because even older cars were photographed in this yellow scheme, and it says right on it what it's for, so that's what that is. And the correct color, as I said, is the depot color, colonial yellow. We have that now from True Color paint, so you can reproduce this today. Over the years, Athearn and other people have done various kinds of lemon yellow and other colors, which are wrong. It should be depot yellow. And then finally the 050-13s, the last of these standard cars. Again, still 12,500 gallon cars. This is the Athearn tank car. double hold downs, the size, a lot of the dome and under frame arrangements. That's the prototype for the Athearn tank car, with some differences, which I'll talk about. And then finally, the 05014, it's just 50 of these little guys, 8,000 gallon cars. Notice this one's got a diamond on the dome. SP did that on some classes and not others. The walkway's on the other side, of course, because this is the right side of the car, as you can see from the drapes. And here's the WA Drake brass model. They offered this lettered for other things. It's a correct General American tank car. Other people that have made 8,000 gallon tank cars have lettered them for SP, but in general they're not right. They have to be General American cars because that's what the prototype was. Just briefly on paint schemes, I've been talking about this as I went along. This is the fuel oil scheme with this aluminum in. This is a challenge because there's black lettering on here, everything else is white lettering. It says diesel fuel oil service here. This is a little direction to shippers. It says don't run this car unless you put the cap back on the thing on the bottom. And you notice here you can see the cap and the chain. This one has been closed. This is, again, one of the cars with the circumferential joints. Notice it looks like it's leaking at a couple of these rivets up here. And this is one of the Sugar Service cars, the giant S on the dome. This one actually was in Sugar Service, it says so right here. But in general, in later years, the S's stayed and they weren't still being used in Sugar Service. This, you'll recognize the building in the background if you know Crockett. That's the C&H plant. And here's one of the gasoline cars. Sorry, this is the diesel Silver Service. It has a black, an aluminum bottom sheet. The way the shadow is, you can't tell for sure, but photographs at more of an angle, it's clear that that's a bottom sheet that's all aluminum. And these survived a long time. This is a picture I took in 1989 at San Luis Obispo. The wooden walkway is getting a little tired, but again, there's the S, but this is in company fuel service. There's a 20,000 gallon company car there behind it. In the 1960s, SP, having not bought any tank cars since 1942, bought some more tank cars. They started with 0100-1, 2 cars, 20,000 gallons capacity, and the story is that these were an experiment. They wanted to see if they liked this size for fuel service. So these were for diesel fuel. There were only ever 2 of them. This is what they looked like. They followed that with 3 classes of cars, 0100-3, 4, and 5. 2, 3, and 4. The 4s were said to be for molten sulfur service, but in fact, they were all lettered for sulfuric acid, and they all seem to have been used in that service. And when you look at in-service photos of these cars, they often have returned to Clifton, Arizona, or one of the other copper smelting places where a lot of sulfur byproduct was, I guess you would say, retained and turned into sulfuric acid. So these are 14,500 gallon, all welded tank cars with tank car platforms. And then finally, the very interesting ones, they bought 2 more of these 20,000 gallon cars, but these are 4 compartment cars. And they were used for lube oil. That way you could distribute it around the system. They've got this very interesting handrail arrangement at the end for workmen to use. It gives you the capacity of the individual compartments. And there's 4 manways naturally in the top for loading the car. So these would be an interesting challenge to build. These were built by General American. I think I didn't mention, it was Richmond Tank Car that built all 3 of these classes of sulfuric acid cars. So that brings us to the end of what I'm going to talk about in the tank cars. Now let's say a little bit about modeling. I kept saying that Athearn tank car is the SP tank car. Well, kind of. Let's talk about that. In the foreground is the Athearn car, although I've added a vertical staff brake pedal at this point in the model. In the back is what they're supposed to look like. The domes are supposed to be tall, they're not supposed to be short, they're not supposed to have 3 safety valves in an equilateral arrangement. Then there's double rivet rows on here. What this is, Athearn correctly modeled a 3-compartment car. Those double rows of rivets that are on the tank are supporting the internal bulkheads which separate the 3 compartments. And the three domes should be small like this, because they're 2% of the volume of each compartment. And they had one safety valve on each one, which again is correct, except there's no prototype. There never were any 12,500 gallon three compartment cars, so it's bogus, but it was done correctly in mechanical terms. You even know, if you've looked at the underframes, there's 3 outlet pops. There's an outlet for each of the 3 compartments. But then when they just blanked off the domes to make a single dome car, they left these rivets, they left all the stuff in the underframe, and they thought, well, we got 3 safety valves, let's put them all into one. So we've got this completely unprototypical equilateral triangle arrangement, which is wrong. And of course, Athearn also gives you that vertical support arrangement for the brake wheel, which is very unusual and certainly not a transition era tank car feature at all. So first of all, you have to fix the dome height because it's visibly quite wrong. I got the idea from Richard Hendrickson. Take a sacrifice body, cut the dome off, and you just put it on top of the other dome. All you have to do is clean up the inside so this lip will sit right on that lip. And that turns out to be really easy to do. You glue that on there and your height is about double, and it's just about right. So it's really pretty easy. I used the 3 dome bodies. They used to only cost 98 cents. I think they now cost $3.98. And you can still buy these from Athearn. And by the way, when you go to Athearn's website and you look at the parts, there's not all that many parts listed. Send an email to Athearn. They only have their high popularity parts on the website. All the other parts that are available, they will be happy to sell you, and you can order them by email, but you have to know the part numbers. You have to send them an email, get the part number, and then you can order and buy things like these 3 dome bodies if you want to. So you see, I've sawed it out, getting as much depth as I possibly can. Then you file the bottom of it flat on a quartz file, which takes less time to do than it takes to describe. Then I use a knife and just shave the inside. And this, again, goes quicker than you think. It's kind of hard to photograph. You may be able to see the lighter color of the taper, and I've left a little bit of a flat lip around it. And then you just glue it onto the car. Now, what I've done also is shaved off all the safety valves and saved them, because you need 2. They should be at the B end, and they should be aligned with each other like this. You can save the manway from underneath them. They pop out, they're not glued in. Notice I've sanded off those extraneous rivet rows, which you don't need, and I've taken off the walk on one side, which also shouldn't be there. And usually you have to use a little putty. These things don't seem to be perfectly round. I don't know exactly why, but from tank car to tank car, they don't exactly match. But notice here I've got a brass grab iron up here, and I put the 2 safety valves in the right place. The tank is going to be repainted later. That's a previous model, you might say. Also, Athearn gives you brake gear reasonably arranged. You can add all the piping and rodding if you want to. It's very easy to do since they've given you the gear in more or less the right places. And when you're all done, you've got a car like this, a walkway on one side and not on the other, vertical staff brake. In this particular car, I use precision scale handrail stanchions, although you don't have to. On a black car, they're not very obvious. You can use the ones that Athearn gives you if you like. And here's a weathered one, again, a similar thing with the correct dome height now, it looks a lot better. And of course, there's lots of paint scheme opportunities. This car, the one with the diesel fuel paint scheme, is out on the table in the train that I brought. You can also do the Block S. There's the gasoline car. I don't have a silver car in this photo. So there's lots of paint schemes you can do if you want to. How about other tank cars? Not just the straight Athearn tank car. Well, you can do other versions of SP tank cars because the 12,500 gallon size is right, and you can scratch both things. I'll come to that in a minute. First, let's think about the circumferential courses. These are pretty easy. I guess it's my Scottish background because I really hated to throw away those bodies with the cut-off domes. So I thought there must be something I can do with it. So I thought, you know what I can do? This opening where the dome was is out toward the end, which is kind of bad for putting on a wrapper. So I thought we'll cut it next to the dome, we'll cut the end off as you see here. That'll just glue it all back together. Here it is all glued back together, but those sections are turned around. So now the opening is towards the middle. That's the right place to put a wrapper over it to cover it. and I've puttied up the joints where I put the ends back on. And then you get a car like this. If you just leave this, you might think, well, this isn't very good because the wrapper comes in the wrong place. Turns out you can fix this too, and I'll show you how I did one this way. I've only done one that way. That turned out to be a lot of fun. But you put the wrapper on and you put rivets, and you've got the riveted tank car, and it's correct for that class. That's an 05010. But I also wanted to make one not with these rivets, which were made by a scriber in styrene sheet. I thought, I want to use Archer rivets. So there weren't any of the little, zigzag rows of rivets. So I did the research. They kindly put my name on here, that I did the research. And I only gave them the data because I wanted the rivets to do the project. But now you can buy these. And with those, it's really easy to put them on the edges of your wrappers. And you can see what I did. I don't care where that is anymore because I put the piece of styrene over the whole thing, and then a second sheet to represent the raised section. And here's how nice the rivets look. This shows you what you can achieve. But I learned an important lesson, and that is that putting black rivets on a black car is really not good. So what I would do now is put a light gray primer before I put this sheet on and started doing rivets. Makes it much easier to put them on.
Tony, if I can ask, how thick was the styrene that you put on
This
for
is
sheet?
5 mil.
5 mil? Okay.
Yeah. Scratch building I don't want to get into. I'll just say that it's easier than you probably think. First of all, the Tichy underframes are really nice. It's an ACF underframe, but you can cut out the end and side sills and make a pretty good General American underframe. Plastruct tubing is available on a whole range of sizes. This is what they call a hemispherical end, and it's too bulgy for transition era cars, but you can readily file and sand it down. It's a real soft acrylic, and you get a dome end like this. It's easy to make domes. I use that thin wall K&S tubing. If you sand it on a piece of the tubing of the body size, again, it takes less time to do this than it takes to tell about it because the aluminum's relatively soft and you can sand it really fast. Make a top for it. Use one of your salvaged Athearn manways and salvaged Athearn safety valves, and you've got it. So this is not at all hard to do with the help of the Tichy underframe. So let's just look at a few operations pictures to remind you. A lot of cars were in company fuel service. Here's a lineup of them at Dunsmere. Not all of them, probably around a third, certainly not more than that. In many years, SP's own statistics said that only about a quarter of that tank car fleet was in company fuel service. So don't imagine that's the only use of them. What were all the rest of them used for? Whatever customers needed. They leased them to people for cotton oil, for things like that, and I'll show you a cotton oil picture in a moment. But they also were used to deliver fuel oil to all kinds of customers, and I'll show you some of those as well. But here's the sugar service. Here's Crockett itself, C&H plant in the background. There's a couple of sugar service cars. This happens to be in July of '53. A lot of them were used for other kinds of things like kerosene, other things that come out of refineries. This is the city service facility in Louisiana, switched by TNNO, and there's quite a few TNNO as well as city service cars in that photograph. Here's a photograph of Procter & Gamble in Long Beach. These cars had vegetable oil in them, being used by Procter & Gamble to make various kinds of products. Here's a fuel oil car being picked up at a packing house in El Centro. The cap is hanging down on the chain. I don't know how well you can see it. So I'm pretty sure it's an empty car. And Dick Steinheimer said he was watching the local do the switching. He took about 20 pictures down there, most of which haven't been published. Very nice pictures of the local doing its switching. And here's a wonderful picture I've always liked. This part of the yard east of Port Costa is not there anymore. I called it Crockett. It's not exactly Crockett either. Every time I go up to Sacramento on the Capitol, I look for when you can see Mount Diablo looking like this, and I look for where this is. Some of the pilings for this facility are still there. But some of those are SP tank cars, and some of them are oil company tank cars. So with that, I'll wrap it up just by saying that railroad archives have survived in amazing quantities around the country. Sometimes they're not very well organized, as in is in this picture, but in this case, there are books, so you don't have to. So with that, I'll say that's all. I'll be happy to answer questions. No,
On the
a lot of
Tony,
that's in the book, not the model, but the prototype information is in the book. Yeah?
on the face of it, the WP tank cars seem to be clones, and I think Pecos River did their brass car. Do you have any knowledge as to how close or not close it is?
It's a very slightly different size, but certainly the Athearn car is a good stand-in. That's right. Again, the dome height has to be right. And UP had one class that's like that. They had one class where the domes were bigger diameter, which would be more of a challenge to model. But they also had a class with domes like the diameter of the SP dome.
Were the sugar service cars relegated to just the one class, or were they scattered with the some of them?
No, there were at least 3 classes I know of that were in that. I've got the SP project book from the 60s, and they'll say convert 4 cars for sugar service. And then the next month it'll say project completed, and it gives the car numbers, and they're from different classes. So I think they just took what was handy, or maybe what was easy to clean.
Owl Mountain had talked about doing some of the older tank cars. Do you know if they're still going to be going ahead on it, or is that?
Well, Jason certainly wants to. He's done a lot of work on doing that 050-5. It's a distinctive car. It's not like anybody else's car. SP only had a few of them. I said, Jason, this is not your best bet. I think you should do an 050-2. And he's done some development work on that, because those lasted in maintenance service to the end of the 60s. So to me, that's an excellent prospect. But I don't know how far along Jason is with any of those projects. But he has about 4 tank cars he would like to do.
I will interject that Jason is here. He showed up late this afternoon. He might even.
Oh, is he in the room?
I'm not sure if he's in the
I
room.
shouldn't be taking his name in vain.
I saw him show up about right before your presentation, just outside.
Well, he's doing superb work. Any of you that have seen the lumber loads,
Yeah.
he's done those elbow safety valves, both the single ones and the double ones in the same pipe. They're just gorgeous. I mean, all of his work that I've seen is just absolutely the top of the mark. So if he will do any of these tank cars, I will certainly get some, but the 050-5, I guess I probably have to put it in maintenance in my area, 53. Anything else? Okay, thanks.
That's it.
You-